And I've got to get up at 6 in the morning to teach English tomorrow. Barry, you've written a wonderful book. It's a giant accomplishment. It took me a few weeks to read it, and I'm grateful for that, you know. I don't like books that I can read in a night. I mean, I like them for that night, but, you know, they're not going to stay with me. This book's going to stay with me, and a lot in it is going to stay with me. Can you tell us how you met William Seward Burroughs?
Well, that's going back a bit. I first corresponded with Bill in 1964 when he was in Tangier, and I was involved with running a lot of little poetry magazines, you know, the mimeograph revolution and everything. And so I wrote to him asking for a manuscript, and he sent back one of his 3-column cut-up things, and we published it in an anthology called Darest, which was Zara backwards, which was a typical sort of literary joke, which has fallen completely flat by now. And
everyone knows who Tristan Tzara.
Well, exactly. Yes, yes. But then he went from Tangier to New York, and he spent about 8 or 9 months here in 1965. When he moved back, then he came to London and re-established himself there. He'd lived there from 1960 through to about 64, but I didn't know him at that point. And in the meantime, I had gotten to know Ian Somerville, who was his ex-boyfriend from 1959. Still a very close friend, but more or less ex-boyfriend. And through Ian, I just met up with Bill, and we became friends. We sort of hung out together. And then I extended my little literary exercises into an underground newspaper. A guy called John Hopkins and myself and a few other people began something called International Times, which was the first European underground paper. And Bill was very excited about the whole thing, and immediately started writing for us. I think he was in the second and the third issue, for instance.
He really believed in the idea of an underground.
He was very keen on the idea of a counterculture in every respect, and particularly the underground press, because it enabled him to get stuff out really quickly in a way that he couldn't do if he was just publishing books. And he liked the idea of a newspaper which was better than poetry magazines. You know, it reached a much bigger audience. And in those days, the early days of the underground press, there was something called the Underground Press Syndicate, which meant that any article in any underground newspaper could be freely reproduced in any other underground newspaper without having to write and ask permission or anything. It was just accepted. If you had a UPS sign inside your paper, you could be, you know, reprinted by anyone.
Kind of like the internet.
Very much like the internet. Yes, I've seen quite a few of my books go like that. You probably have too.
Oh yes.
So what happened, of course, was he would write something for IT, and the Los Angeles Free Press would pick it up, and the Berkeley Barb, and East Village Other, Rat. I mean, you know, he was reaching a huge audience that way, and this is in a way how his sort of revolutionary credentials were forged, you know, because in the 60s he was known very much as a sort of radical and mentor of youth, as it were, you know, and his ideas often clashed with his contemporaries. I mean, while Allen Ginsberg was practicing, you know, preaching free, not free, well, he preached that as well, preaching, you know, peace and meditation, and Bill was saying things like, the only way I would like to give a flower to a policeman is in a flower pot from a high window, and that's and he was saying, you know, the more
he was very negative about
the more people
police.
Revolt, the better, you know. Oh, he was. Well, he'd had a bad time with the police.
Oh yeah.
So I got to know him, and then in 1972 he asked me to describe his archives, so I catalogued his archives, and that's when I really got to know him well. It was over about a 7-month period when I saw him, not quite every day, but I worked together for a long period with him, and we would exactly at 6 o'clock, after a great deal of checking his watch, you know, he would pour an industrial quantity of scotch and soda, and that was the evening wiped out pretty much. I mean, it reached a stage actually where I had to go and throw up before we went out to dinner, because I couldn't possibly handle it. I could barely walk, let alone.
I was always amazed by how much he could consume.
It was astonishing. I mean, he did get totally incoherent. I mean,
at times,
but
At
nonetheless,
the end of it, yeah.
But he had stamina.
He did. It sounds like you've been writing this book for 40 years.
Yeah, it's sort of like that. Yeah, because although I've written about a lot of other people, Bill has always been there as the main. For me, he was always the key member of the Beat generation. And although Allen Ginsberg was probably a better friend, and I knew him better because Allen always stayed with me when he came to London, and I spent a lot of time on his farm in upstate New York, and we even lived on a floor in a hippie commune in Berkeley in 1971 for about 8 months. He and my girlfriend and I. So that's a bit different. Seeing Allen wandering around in his underwear and everything is you get to know somebody real well that way, right?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Whereas I never saw that with Bill, fortunately. So that was. But it was. I think it was the combination of his political ideas, which were often completely crackpot, but somehow always had a poetic truth about them, and beautiful writing at times. I mean, there's some of the books I prefer the best are quite hard to get. Like the first version of Soft Machine is filled with wonderful prose and just absolutely poetic sentences. And it's just like a prose poem, and he kept rewriting it. He rewrote it twice after that to try and make it more commercial and more accessible to people. But I think the original is just like Nightwood or one of those high modernist books.
Peter Scaldahl in The New Yorker says he doubts that too many people have read any parts of that trilogy. Nova Express, Ticket That Exploded, Soft Machine. I mean, do you agree with that?
It's probably true.
Probably true.
Yeah, I think
it's just too dense to get through. He says it's harder than Finnegan's Wake.
Well,
I
find Finnegan's Wake much harder. But
it's in that league, right?
It's in that league, yeah.
Yeah.
There's such a lot of made-up words in Finnegan's Wake, whereas at least with Bill, they're all recognizable. But you shouldn't try and look for a story there. There's no narrative or anything. You just dip in and out. If you just approach it as a prose poem, it's fine. It's just if you impose looking for the bourgeois novel or some kind of narrative, you're not going to find it. Not in any of his books, really, since Junkie and Queer, and maybe there's a bit of a story in the last trilogy, but most of them you can dip in and read them in any order you want, really.
But there was some kind of return to narrative in The Wild Boys, and I remember when I read that, I was kind of relieved.
Although The Wild Boys was, in the end, he told me that really Port of Saints and the last half of The Wild Boys should have been one book, and the first half of Wild Boys was an entirely separate subject, and should have been published somehow in some other form. I mean, his books were very fugitive. It was he found it extremely hard to pin them down. Even Naked Lunch, for instance, the version that was published here was actually an earlier draft than the one published in France in 1959. And so even then, I mean, he started off on with a book which there was no fixed text of. And then when we revised it, at one point I had asked Bill whether the repetitions in Naked Lunch were intentional, and he said no, it was a pure accident. That the same sections had been typed up twice and sent to the typesetter, and they weren't intended to be repeated. So when James Garholtz and I edited it, we cut those out, or at least there was one repetition we left in because we just couldn't really remove it without destroying the surrounding text.
So that's another interesting thing, the extent to which Burroughs was a collaborationist, that he had people working on his manuscripts.
Always.
I can't think of another writer who depended on his friends as much. Can you?
No, not at all. You're absolutely right.
So that's really unique.
Yeah.
It's almost like a film director. A film director has to have all these people doing all these jobs.
He began as a collaborator. His very first text was when he was at Harvard. He worked on
with Kells.
With Kells Elvins. Then he stopped writing then until after the Lucian Carr, David Camera murder, and then Kerouac persuaded him to write a hard-boiled detective story about it, which was hippos were boiled in their tanks.
Right.
Which wasn't really a collaboration. It was just Bill would write one chapter and Jack would write the other, and Kerouac would say, "Well, what do you think?" And he would say, "Oh, it's all right." You know, so he'd never get any real feedback from Burroughs about his bits. But and then later on, of course, Naked Lunch was composed pretty much out of letters written to Ginsberg, and only after 2 or 3 years worth of letters with long routines and amusing sort of stories in it, did they realize that this actually was a book, and that rather than Bill be writing separately in Tangier, really these routines were what the book was about, and it was a epistolatory novel. I mean, it was just so then they went over and again,
and picaresque at the same time,
and picaresque, and then they like you say, there was a whole team of people put that together. Kerouac came over to do some of the typing, Ginsberg worked with him editing it, and Alan Anson came in from Greece, and then the one after that, Soft Machine. Burroughs wrote it with a lot of help from Ian Somerville and people like that, and then he left the manuscript in a completely unfinished form and shot off to Tangier just before Ginsberg arrived in Paris to see him. So Alan put it together without Bill even being there, with the aid of Brian Geisen, and then Geisen designed a dust wrapper for it, and Alan wrote the blurb, and it was a real collaboration, Beat Generation collaboration, and so on and so forth, right down to James Grauholz's central role in the final trilogy. So you're right. Virtually everything was a collaborative event of some sort.
It's so unusual because the one thing that I've noticed about hanging out with writers is the sense of ego.
Yeah.
And this is the opposite of that, isn't it?
Yes. No.
You're giving your power away.
It was odd. Because Bill was quite proud of his role as a writer, and yet he was sloppy, I guess, in the end. I think once the ideas were down on paper, that was almost enough for him. When he was writing Naked Lunch, for instance, I mean, apparently the paper would just come straight out of the carriage onto the floor in Tangier, and so the wind would blow it out into the garden, and the cats would shit on it, and it was. And then eventually, every few days, he'd gather all these manuscripts up, and somebody like Paul Bowles would come over and Bill would read aloud from it, but there was no real care about the order of things. Once the ideas were down, that was it, really. I think, although he rewrote endlessly. I mean, he wasn't like Kerouac in the slightest. It was almost every text had been worked on 4 or 5 times, probably, if not more.
Well, everything about the two of them was totally different, I think. To what extent do you think that what was the initial public image that was understood to be William Burroughs formed by what Kerouac had written and said?
Oh, I think the Burroughs brand was definitely started by him. I mean, the way he was portrayed in Kerouac is to a certain extent the way he's still thought of even now. This kind of rather sinister, cold figure, some kind of steely intelligence and all the rest of it. Comes very much the teacher and the guru. And he was a mentor to those guys because he was so much older, apart from anything else, and he'd been to Europe a lot before the war, and they hadn't really travelled. Kerouac had been a merchant seaman, of course, but for somebody like Ginsberg, I mean, he encountered Burroughs. I mean, Alan was only 17, I think, when they met, and Bill was about 30.
Yeah.
So it wasn't even really a generation. I mean, that's pretty much a misnomer. And he was this guy who had not a huge library, but a very selected library of very interesting texts, and everything from Hart Crane to Korzybski to Spengler and Celine, people like that. I mean, they'd never heard of any of these people.
Right. Yeah. Paul Bowles once remarked that the Burroughs legend existed in spite of Burroughs. And never because William sought to pursue it. But it has developed. And, I'm sure that in the work that you've done, you've been able to see points where legend becomes almost myth.
Well, that's true, yeah.
And it would be interesting if you could pinpoint 1 or 2 of those points.
Well, in his private life, he always wanted to be, what the Spanish boys in Tangier called him, El Hombre Invisible, largely because he was gay and he was a junkie, both of which were illegal at that time. And so he wanted to keep it as low a profile as possible. But he actually changed like a chameleon in each city that he lived in. I mean, he was almost a different person as well. I mean, depending on the group of friends he was with, he would take on some of their political ideas. I don't think he really necessarily believed them, but he would behave. He would fit right in and share the same kind of humor and the same kind of jokes, the same, outrageous opinions. Quite
You
often.
mean a chameleon notion?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
You know, when he was in Tangier, he was in an entirely expat gay set. You know, he saw hardly anyone else. In London, he moved in a much more aristocratic sort of area. You know, he lived next to the Queen virtually. I mean, he was in St James's, some of the most expensive real estate in the world, and he had his, his hats and his shoes were all handmade, and he lived like a lord there because he was friends with the other people in his building. Anthony Balch, the filmmaker, for instance, Christopher Gibbs, Lord Londonderry. I mean, he moved in very high circles, as it were, in every respect, actually. And there was mainly a gay scene, but he was much more integrated into the art scene in London because he knew a lot of mainly American theatre directors and people like Charles Marovitz, and there was another. I can't remember his name now. A number of people who put on events, and Bill played. Well, he did theatrical roles. I mean, he played Judge Hoffman in a reenactment of the Chicago trial. Right. He played the President of the United States in a play at some little experimental theatre. So he was much more integrated there rather than just being.
Didn't he play Dr. Benway in Bruckner's film?
Well, he does. Yes,
yeah.
that was the only bit they actually acted out. It was brilliant piece of acting.
Yeah.
So that was shot much later, of course. That would be. By the time he moved to the States in 74. Right. I mean, the interesting thing is, because Burroughs wrote all of his books abroad until he moved here when he was 60. So he really was the classic American expatriate writer. And as he moved around the world, I mean, he had this thing of he would go to a new city, he wouldn't know anybody, so he would hate it and consequently take a lot of drugs. But then he would get to know people and then start to like the place. And somewhere like Tangier and in Paris and in London at various times, he's said this is the only place possible to live. It's absolutely wonderful. Then he gets bored, and
he kept going back to Tangier, though.
He did, but in the end, even Tangier, he saw no reason to ever go.
It had changed.
Yeah. Well, it has changed enormously.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So in the end, he's got this ever-changing persona of who is Bill Burroughs, and that gives rise to a myth, I think. I mean, when I first heard of him, I was a teenager, I was an art student, and here he was, he'd written this absolutely outrageous book, which was unlike any other book I'd ever read, Naked Lunch, and he was known to be a junkie, and it was rumored that he'd maybe killed his wife, and I mean, it was just like, to someone who's 17, it's just amazing stuff, particularly back in 1961 or whenever it was, 60. So, he was the man. He was always like one of the coolest people you'd ever heard of. Who was still on the planet. That is.
I think that continued. I think that continued, and that's what people believed. And I remember the Nova Convention here in 1978, I think it was, and that was the impression that you got, that this was the cool center of a white burning heat.
Yeah. And that attracted a lot of people. I mean, often outside his normal field. I mean, when I knew him in the 60s, for instance, he was, people like Paul McCartney was very interested in him and put him on the cover of Sgt. Pepper, for instance.
Right. I have that album.
So well, there you go. A lot of people have got that one.
Yeah. And, Burroughs is so recognizable in that crowd. Yeah.
So it goes way back, in other words. It's not just when, Kurt Cobain and all those people much later. He's always attracted people from other genre who can see something there that they're attracted to, that they can use maybe. That
also it's that idea of collaboration that so many other
Yeah.
artists have been attracted to him for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's George Condo or Kurt Cobain or 24 others.
No, that's right. I mean, the only area that he really was unsure about, I think, is the rock and roll thing. When, you know, there was one time when he first got to New York that he was quite broke actually, and he was trying to make money writing for Crawdaddy. And one of the things he did was they commissioned him to interview Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin. So he went to a Led Zepp concert, and I mean, absolutely hated it.
Mm-hmm.
And had nothing really to say to Jimmy Page, but they found a mutual interest in magic, and so it's a very interesting interview actually. And then again, you know, David Bowie interviewed him for Rolling Stone, which is a very interesting thing. But again, Bill couldn't talk about Bowie or music because it wasn't his scene at all. Mm-hmm. And but all these people kept coming, and Bill's personal taste in music it stopped when he stopped being a youth, really. I mean, he liked Viennese waltzes and the Hot Fives and Hot Sevens of Louis Armstrong and early Lester Young, stuff like that. Pre-war, all of it. Mm-hmm. And Moroccan music. From his years living in Morocco, he really began to appreciate Gnawa music and Jajuka music and all of that.
And that's something that Brian Geisen shared with him.
Introduced him to it, and as did Paul Bowles probably. Yeah, he became a good friend of Paul Bowles.
You know, we had a phenomenal exhibition of Brian's work here at the New Museum a couple of years ago.
I missed that. Yes,
and it was extraordinary. They had the Dream Machine there, but it was the rest of the stuff that was displayed that was very, very impressive. The New Museum is down on the Bowery, right where Bill used to live when I met him.
It's across the street from there.
Yeah.
No, I went to a few days ago. Yeah.
Okay.
How are we doing here? Should we get the...
I think we should.
How are we doing for time?
Yeah, we can definitely open it up.
Okay.
Sure. Does anybody have any questions for Barry or John this evening? I'm actually going to bring in a microphone just for our own purposes. Here you go.
What did you make of Skeldall's assessment of Brian Geisen, since you just mentioned it, as what do you call it, not a very good artist? He said he was sort of a routine. I forget the exact word. It was a real terrible put down.
Well,
and Skeldall was not
He said the same thing about Williams' painting.
Well, yeah.
He said he was a terrible artist as well. He reviewed my book Naked Angels in 1976, whenever, in the New York Times, and I was telling this story a few moments ago. There was a copy editing error in my book, so that the name Jackson Pollock was misspelled. In the review in the Times, he said, "This guy knows nothing about art," meaning me, because of this mistake. So that's the way I would answer the question. I don't share that belief. Not about Geisen's work at all.
Yeah, to be quite honest, I've only very quickly skipped over that article. It looks fabulous to me because, of course, it's a big long review in the New Yorker, so it's fabulous.
It's a fabulous piece for you and your book. Believe me, whether he says certain snotty things along the way, absolutely, it is a fabulous tribute to you. You know, even if you get a review this size, then you're being noticed. But this is 4 or 5 pages, okay, with Avedon's photograph. It's a great photograph. Oh yeah, I think they've used that same photograph before, actually.
Yeah. I think that picture actually was Avedon at his very best. Bill told me the story of how it was taken, and Avedon sat him down, and I think it was on the roof of either his studio or maybe it was on the roof of the Chelsea, I'm not sure. And it was a hot day, and Bill was quite uncomfortable and starting to sweat. And it was only when he got really uncomfortable did he take a couple of pictures. And he didn't even shoot a whole roll. He just did about 5 or 6. And there it is. And it really captures him. It's that kind of slightly irritated, slightly grumpy sort of side. I think it's a brilliant picture.
We have another question just out this way.
Thank you. Stu.
Do you remember, over Williams' writing station in the bunker, there was a Brian Geisen painting.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I remember the first time I saw it was from maybe 20 feet away. I just saw a splash of color. Okay. As you walked into the painting, you saw it was a Moroccan marketplace, and the specks became people.
Yeah.
You remember that?
Yeah.
That's when I realized how good Geisen was.
Yeah.
How potent his
No,
work
that's a
was.
beautiful painting. Yeah, yeah. No, I personally love Brian's work, and I've got a few, in fact, fortunately. Couldn't afford to buy them, but he gave them to me. So.
Any other questions up there?
So when Burroughs came back to New York in the 70s, he developed this whole kind of second career as a performer. And I know he gave readings in the 60s, but I was wondering if you could describe how they might have been different, if they were, in fact, before he developed this kind of career as a performer and whatnot. But were they more intimate? Was he more nervous about them or anything like that?
In the 60s, most of his performances were done in London. They were at the Institute of Contemporary Art, the ICA, and in Paris they were usually part of a much more elaborate performance thing that he did with Jean-Jacques Lebel, and they were much more. This is a period when people have been doing a lot of happenings, and the idea of multimedia events was very common. And the general thing that I'm just trying to remember what they're called. Domaine poétique. Usually there would be Brian Geisen would do a big painting on stage, about 6 foot wide sheet of paper that he would be splashing away at and doing his calligraphic painting. There would be sometimes live music, a saxophone player or something like that. There would be films and projections, either with an epidascope. I think it's an epidascope where they project images. You put something on a table and it's projected. Right. Or else, if they had access to film, there would be films, often playing right on him. And these are the kind of things that they were doing publicly that they initially developed at the Beat Hotel, where there's famously one event that Burroughs did at the Beat Hotel when they told everyone in the hotel that Burroughs was going to become invisible and they could come and watch. And basically it was a couple of Venetian blinds, and I can't even quite remember how it worked, but there was an image of Burroughs.
He melted into the floor.
He melts into the floor. Yeah,
right.
Basically, the projector projected a picture of Burroughs onto Burroughs, and then onto the screen, and then onto Burroughs, and then onto the screen, and eventually, no one really knew which they were looking at. And at one point, Bill just sank down, and people carried on watching the picture of Burroughs on the screen, thinking it was still him, and he had crawled off. And this was the sort of thing he just did in his room. I mean, it wasn't done for money or for a paid audience or anything. It's he did take the precaution, however, of distributing little balls of hashish to everybody in the hotel an hour before, so that they were in the right mood really to see some magic. And then I put on an event at the ICA in London in about 65, I suppose it must have been, when he first came back, I guess, and that involved a very, very loud cut-up tape, which actually cleared about half of the audience because it was played back at such terribly high volume, and it was composed almost entirely of pneumatic drills, radio static, distorted Moroccan flutes, which sound pretty terrifying, and bits of Bill being cut in of him reading from disaster reports from the...
Sounds like Antonin Artaud.
Well, very influenced, probably.
Yeah.
Very influenced.
Yeah.
And stills from Towers Open Fire were being projected onto him at the time, and Brian was doing one of his paintings behind. And so that was a sort of standard evening. So in other words, they were much more art performances, whereas when he came here, he basically went out on tour as a performer to make money, to paying audiences, and so he was just doing. He developed a very good routine. I mean, he found the most audience accessible pieces from his work, and so they were humorous, but but good texts, and he really perfected it in the end. I mean, he became like a sort of W.C. Fields kind of character.
I invited him once to Queens College and asked him to read Roosevelt after the inauguration.
Oh, great.
And he did it brilliantly. I didn't think it would be received that well in that community, but he did it brilliantly.
He did about 200 readings, I think, altogether. I never really got access to the right paperwork to figure out how many, but that didn't really matter. But he did it for years. And in the end, he sort of resented it. I mean, this, in his journals, you know, he says, here I am, you know, sort of 75 years old or something, and I'm still having to go out and sing for my supper kind of thing.
When I invited him, it was at the beginning, and to make sure that he was going to be in Queens, I drove him out there with a couple of others, and took him out for dinner. He ate nothing, but he kept drinking vodka and Coke, one after another. Then the reading was going to be in this building, and he took an elevator up to the 4th floor. He said, no, I'd rather walk. So I went with him in the stairwell, and out comes a couple of joints.
Right.
I was untenured. And they didn't have cameras in all the corners the way they do now, you know. And then we had the reading.
Right.
And he read Roosevelt after the inauguration, you know.
Well, that would get him into the right frame of mind. Yeah. No, he did like to get his head into the right place, as he put it. Although, as James Grohart said, it was sometimes, you know, he got too far into it and, you know, didn't give such a great reading. But
right.
I think, generally speaking, most of them were very good, though. He was a great performer, and it was yet another career, just like the painting career. It didn't even begin until 1984 or something.
If you can see the performance on Saturday Night Live, you know, he was brilliant.
Yeah.
That's the one where he was introduced by a very beautiful woman named Lauren Hutton as the greatest writer in America.
Yeah.
And
astonishing, really. I mean, he got on there at all, really.
Yeah, well, she knew more than you realize. You know, she bought my pound book and told me how good she thought it was.
Well, there you are.
She must have known something.
Wonderful. Well, considering how you've outlined Burroughs' music proclivities and how they kind of stopped at a certain point, I'm curious to know how things like his collaboration with Kurt Cobain came about.
Well, that was Cobain himself made the approach, and I guess it must have been organized by James Grohart. And what happened was they'd simply recorded a tape and sent it to Cobain in Seattle, I guess, and he went into a studio and did 15-20 minutes of sort of psychedelic noodling, and that was it. They hadn't met. They didn't meet again until at least a year later, I think. And then Cobain was on tour, and he came to, I suppose, Kansas City, and his roadie drove him over to meet Bill. And Bill found him quite disturbed, actually. I mean, he just said, there's something wrong with that boy. He's always frowning, you know. And of course, he had never heard Nirvana or anything. So I wonder how he found it performing. I don't suppose he listened to it, to be quite honest.
Are there any other questions out there? I've got one back in.
Great collaboration with Tom Waits and Robert Wilson on The Black Rider, where
that's true. Yes,
performs in it.
But that was, I mean, that was writing a libretto.
Yes.
And he really did enjoy that very much.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But it's opera basically. Yes. It was an opera. And he was very much part of it, yeah. And it's that particular play, opera, is still touring the world. I mean, people still put it on all over the place. It's a very interesting piece of work.
Very interesting.
His voice, his performance. I mean, he's exciting. Very much his performance live.
Yes. Yeah, well, I think by then he'd really gotten that kind of performance down, and so he did a really good job, and he was a good match really with Waits, who obviously liked him as well. I mean, you know, I think there was a real rapport there, and it was a fabulous.
Did you see the performance?
Only in England when.
Was he there?
No, he wasn't. No, I missed it. It was. I think only in Germany did Burroughs actually. I don't really know actually. It's probably somebody else here. Do you remember the story?
Black Rider?
Yeah. Burroughs didn't perform in it here, did he? In New York? No, I don't.
There was a voiceover of him.
Ah, right.
There are demo recordings with him singing a song or two. One of the songs.
Well, on the CD.
Yeah, on the CD he sings. Yeah. That's an acquired taste, actually. Bill singing, quite honestly.
Other questions out there tonight?
The
We got another one.
cucaracha song, you mean?
Right.
The word ecstasy, the etymology is ex plus to cause to stand outside of yourself. And I'm wondering, a lot of William Burroughs' writing seems to be ecstatic in that sense. In a lot of times, you know, in the West, it's hard for us to be ecstatic because we're, you know, it isn't culturally, and so that's why we use substances to kind of to get to that state. In your knowing him, did you feel that he exhibited that quality? I never met him in his person. Was he an ecstatic person, or was he kind of full of himself?
Oh, that's
I would say neither.
neither really, but he did believe in the magical universe. And from even when he was a child, he had a number of experiences of having visions, and he saw a little green reindeer in the park and all kinds of stuff like that. Which it was something instead of thinking he would grow out of it. I mean, he nurtured it and always kept it. And particularly when he was in Morocco, he got very interested in the magical practices of the Berbers and all the rest of it. And he was always open to any kind of, well, I wouldn't say supernatural ideas, but he toyed around with all of that. I wouldn't say he was never ecstatic, although I've seen him get pretty rowdy, but that's that's not quite the same.
Anyone else just out here? Sorry, yeah, thank you.
You said that William Burroughs, early on in his life, was very interested in pulp fiction, pulp magazines. Would that have been at the period that L. Ron Hubbard was a real power in pulp magazine writing? This was early in the Burroughs' life, but since later he was interested in Dianetics.
Yes, I mean, he got into Scientology in about 1960, introduced by Brian Geisen. He read pulp novels, I mean, from way back, wherever they were first introduced, I guess, because he comes from so far back that people, he was born in 1914, he's from the era of silent movies and steam cars and electric cars and all of this kind of thing, and really the days before any kind of mass entertainment or anything. So he did grow up with all those hard-boiled detective stories and then later on science fiction. But he was out of the country, of course, from the early 40s really until the 70s. So he missed a lot of the stuff which most science fiction writers grew up with in this country.
I got time for just one more down in front.
Thanks. Drawing from both your comments about the collaborative effort of the writing and the extent to which it's like film, do you think there's anything to be drawn from directors that people find inaccessible in the way you said that people find Burroughs hard to read, like Bresson or Godard, and the extent to which, when you watch those films over and over again, you get into them a lot more and you start to understand them a lot more. Do you think the books have that aspect?
But if you carry on, if you keep reading them, oh yes. I mean, my problem is I've probably read them all too much. In the end, I really don't know how accessible they are. But there are parallels with Altman, with Godard, with loads of filmmakers. I would think that they always, they bear watching again and again. And I think. I mean, I basically grew up on that French New Wave stuff. I mean, that was when I was at art college, and that was what was happening. So, to me, it was all part of the same movement, really, of beat writing, cut-ups, film, collages. There was a whole big period of collage. There was a big show at the Museum of Modern Art, for instance. One of the standard works on collage came out at about 1961, I think. That was, in the air, as it were.
You just think Zara started it all.
Well, He certainly did. The cut-up thing, yes, certainly. Although, I mean, there's a big difference between pulling words out of a hat and basically moving texts against each other until you find a little line that works. Because Bill would normally only get 1 or 2 lines out of a whole page of cut-ups.
Well, with Zorro, it was more of a theatrical.
Well, of course it was. Yes.
Outrage.
Yes.
You know.
Pull out his hat size. Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Wonderful. That concludes the chat portion of the evening. We hope you'll stick around in order to meet Barry and John and get some titles signed by them. On behalf of the Strand, Barry and John, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and thank you all for braving the chilly weather to come out too. Have a good evening.
Thanks for coming.